Sandwiched between England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, the Isle of Man is an interesting piece of land that's virtually unknown to the world. No, it is not named in honor of mankind, but after the Irish god of the Otherworld, Manannán, the son of the sea. It's a self-governing nation, but it's not independent. The English monarch is the Lord of Mann, but the island itself is not part of the United Kingdom. It has its own Gaelic language, although it greatly fell out of use. So did I spark your interest? I hope I did, because we're about to dive into the history of the Isle of Man. First, let's start at the basics. The British Isles weren't always islands, they were once connected to mainland Europe. But some 10,000 years ago, as the Ice Age was coming to an end, sea levels rose and the Isle of Man was cut off from the surrounding land, just as the Isles of Great Britain were gradually separating from the mainland. For the next 1500 years, the island remained uninhabited by humans until the first hunter-gatherers arrived by sea. These people lived in small natural shelters and spent most of their time fishing, hunting, or gathering their food. The only things they left behind are their flint and bone tools and not much else. Things changed towards the end of the Stone Age, when farming, domestication of animals and the building of settlements took root in the island. Now these people left behind more than just their tools. Their megalithic monuments and tombs still dot the landscape and speak of a bygone era of which we know barely anything. Which of course should come as no surprise, since these monuments are 6,000 years old and more. Towards the Iron Age and the end of Prehistory, Celtic influence reached this small piece of land. Brittonic Celts arrived, built hill forts and roundhouses and mostly kept for themselves. When the Romans invaded and conquered Britain, the Isle of Man seems to have been left alone. It was in the 5th century AD that the Irish began to migrate or invade Man, and the basis of the modern Manx language and culture began to form. According to tradition, with the Irish came Saint Mogholl, a missionary with a colourful tale. It is said that Mogholl tried to trick Saint Patrick by placing a living man under a shroud and then asking Patrick to revive the allegedly dead man. Patrick came, placed his hand on the shroud and left, leaving the quote-unquote dead man really dead. Mogholl apologized, Patrick revived the man and baptized everyone, and then asked Mogholl to help his men to lead good lives. He arrived to the Isle of Man, thus beginning the Christian era of the Manx. The next centuries of history are a little bit sketchy, as not a lot of written records have been found. We know of a few invasions from neighboring kingdoms that may have happened, but not much else. That is until the Norsemen arrived. Starting from the end of the 8th century, Vikings began to visit the island not as tourists of course, but as plunderers. Then they began to settle and rule Man under the Norse kings of Dublin. Supposedly, the Vikings also set up a parliament known as Tynwald in 979 AD, which still exists to this day. Although there are no written records of the formation of this council in that year, the people of the Isle proud themselves with the fact that their parliament is the oldest in continuous existence on the planet. Under Norse rule, the Kingdom of the Isles was formed, an entity that had its overlords in Ireland, and Norway, then England, and Scotland, and Orkney. In 1066, Godred Crovan arrived on the Isle and was received by his kin, King Gottfrid. By 1079, Godred took over and he became the King of the Isles. His kingdom included the Hebrides and the southwestern islands of Scotland, and this was man's moment in the sun. The kingdom was ruled from Peel Castle and dominated the Irish Sea, but it was still under the suzerainty of the kings of Norway. Little is known about the life of the Manx in Norse time, as there are few written records or archaeological evidence. There are, however, numerous runestones that survive to this day, as many as 26, which is actually a big number considering that Norway has 33 in total. Now, having said that, it's worth noting that the Manx runestones were raised for Christian purposes and are akin to high crosses. As we enter the 13th century, we see a growing friction between Norway and the growing power of the Kingdom of Scotland. This was the beginning of the end of Norse rule in Man. In 1261, Alexander III of Scotland sent an envoy to Norway to negotiate for the Isles, but failed. The war that followed ended with Norway ceding the Isles, while the reigning king of Man, Magnus Olafsson, had to pay homage to the Scots. 2 years later, in 1266, he died, and Norway ceded Man to Scotland for good in exchange for good old-fashioned money. But this didn't bring peace for a long time. You see, another powerful kingdom was on the rise, and they also set their eyes on this little island. In 1290, King Edward I of England sent his commander to seize possession of Man. From this moment until 1346, control of the island passed back and forth between the two more than a few times. When English rule was finally settled, then followed the quarrels between the noblemen who sold, bought, fought and killed for ownership of these lands. In 1405, Sir John Stanley was granted these lands and became the titular king of Man. And in exchange for homage to the crown and 2 falcons for all future kings of England on their coronations, Stanley's heirs could also keep their lands and titles. With the accession of the Stanleys to the throne, there begins a more peaceful era in Manx history. Though these new rulers rarely visited Man, they had a great deal of influence over it. They introduced trial by jury, replacing trials by battle. Yes, that was an actual thing, ordered laws to be written, and treated the locals with the justice of the time. But in 1643, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms broke out, a series of wars in England, Scotland and Ireland that at this point had the same king, Charles I. James Stanley, 7th Earl of Derby, came to Man only to find it on the brink of rebellion. He managed to restore peace, making minimal concessions, but this wasn't the end of it. It's 1649 now, King Charles I was executed and James Stanley was summoned to surrender the island. He refused, sided with King Charles II, was defeated, captured, tried and executed in 1651. All the while, the Manx militia rose up and captured the island's forts, and the new ruler, Thomas Fairfax, was appointed Lord of Mann and the Isles. The following period is known as the Interregnum, a period in which England was under various forms of republican government. That ended in 1660 when the monarchy was restored. Charles Stanley, the 8th Earl of Derby, was given back ownership of the island. He tried to punish the rebel leaders, but King Charles II prevented him by announcing a general amnesty. Then Stanley tried to dispute the permanency of land ownership, which led to an almost open rebellion again. It didn't, but instead there was a deliberate neglect of agriculture, with people rather tending to fisheries and contraband trade. This agrarian question was settled in 1704 with the Act of Settlement that secured the tenants in the possession of their estates in perpetuity. In other words, it codified the preservation of peasants' rights in relations to their lords, and it was such an important act that the locals called it the Manx Magna Carta. While agriculture resumed to its normal scale, contraband trade didn't go away. In fact, by the mid-1700s it assumed such proportions that in the interest of the imperial revenue it became necessary to suppress it. So in 1765 the Parliament passed the Isle of Man Purchase Act, known as the Reinvestment Act. The rights as Lords of Man were bought for £70,000 sterling, and the British Crown was now the direct ruler of Man. This wasn't good news for the locals. The island's parliament was now subject to the decisions of the Westminster Parliament, who regarded Man as a pestilent nest of smugglers. Needless to say, they didn't have the locals' best interest in mind and tried to extract as much revenue as possible from them. It was only in the mid-19th century that smuggling all but disappeared, revenues increased and tariffs began to be somewhat less stringent. Those high tariffs from the past choked the island for decades and public works were gravely neglected. But starting from 1866, the Manx obtained a greater measure of home rule, or local autonomy, had limited democratic elections, and since then they've made some remarkable progress. During Victorian times, the Isle of Man began to attract visitors from Britain, and by the mid-20th century they became a prime tourist destination of the British Isles. They also developed the infrastructure and became a thriving offshore financial center. The Manx language was also given a lot more attention, and there was a limited revival of it, although the last native speaker of Manx Gaelic died in the 1970s. Music, food and traditional dances also became a centerpiece of the island's culture. Fun fact, Maurice, Robin and Barry Gibb, in other words the Bee Gees, were all from this island. And another thing that made Man a famous place is the Isle of Man Tourist Trophy, a motorcycle racing event that takes place every year since 1907. And one of the reasons why it's so famous is because it's among the most dangerous racing events in the world. So as you can see, the Isle of Man isn't such a boring place after all. Celts, Vikings, wars, castles and races are all packed neatly into the history of this place. And in case you ever visit the island, well, now you know a bit more about it. I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. You can leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.